Hello, Varlets. After much playing around to find a build worthy of being called a Storm Witch, I've settled on this. And as you can see, it's missing even more points than the Cinder Mage build. This video will show you how you can make an Electrokinetic Staff viable even in high Havocs. But how you do it is going to depend on a couple of factors. Learning from my last video, this one is going to be sectioned better with newer Psyker players in mind and help ease them into using the build. So let's get it on. Starting with our melee weapon of choice, after playing with a bunch of different weapons that would make up for the weakness of this build, I've decided that the Force Greatsword is probably the most suitable and fun choice for me. Unlike the Inferno Staff, which doesn't struggle against melee enemies, this build doesn't have that same luxury. In fact, melee enemies will be your greatest annoyance, especially in Havoc 40. So while you could go with the Dueling Sword or even as a Demos, as I did initially, there was a lack of synergy with the playstyle of the build. Since the star of the show is the Electro Staff, our Force Greatsword is going to be built for utility and lesser enemy clear, rather than focusing on actually being a full-on damage weapon. To this end, I'm going to use the Mark 6 for easier horde clear with its light attack chain, and I've also opted for warp resistance to be at 80%, dumping mobility instead. For perks, I've chosen Maniac damage for dealing with mutants quickly as possible, and Carapace damage for if it's absolutely necessary for you to fight crushers in melee. For blessings, the one that caught my attention to support this build was Murderous Tranquility. Because this build doesn't have the same stagger power in a cone like the Inferno Staff, you are going to find yourself in melee combat much more often, at least to protect yourself from small groups and ambushes. This allows you to quell some peril to give your Electro Staff a bit of breathing room to work with if you need to quick swap back to kill snipers or bombers or to stop a crusher or two with your charge attacks. In Damnation and Auric Maelstrom, this isn't too big of a deal since you can quick quell to give yourself a little bit of peril buffer to play with, but because from Havoc 30 onwards, Psykers suffer a minus 85% quelling debuff, you'll actually find yourself very tight on peril given the tempo of the mission and how much peril you are spending with your staff. If you don't like Murderous Tranquility, you can replace it with Momentum for toughness regeneration, this was my second choice, or you can take Shred or Unstable Power for more offense. The other blessing I've chosen is Wrath. The increased cleave allows for better horde management and helps consistently activate Murderous Tranquility when hordes become thicker, literally because their hit mass is increased in Havoc. If you want to learn more about the Force Greatswords, I have a dedicated review for it as well. Now, let's talk about the Electro Staff. We are going to invest in as much crit as possible, taking crit chance on our perk, Surge for the double shot and the extra 5% crit, as well as Warp Nexus. The last perk we're taking is going to be Carapace, mainly because everything that isn't a crusher pretty much gets obliterated in moments, and this staff can actually give a decent pummeling to crushers. Anyway, moving on to our all-important talent selection, as you saw earlier, the tree was not complete, with 6 points still remaining. This is because those points will be allocated depending on if you are the only Psyker in the team, the composition of your team as a whole, and your confidence in your team's abilities. But first, the core talents of the build. Soul Stealer and Perilous Combustion are the usual suspects, but the new thing to see here is Warp Expenditure, where you restore toughness on melee attacks, as well as overtime from weak spot kills. I value this over metal because, as I've mentioned before, one of the struggles this build will have is melee combat. So giving ourselves the ability to better regenerate toughness when we're probably going to need it the most weighs more heavily in favor of Warp Expenditure. This build will also be taking Smite. Can't be a Storm Witch without taking the ability to literally project lightning from your fingertips, can you? Smite is also the reason why I have chosen Murderous Tranquility for the Force Greatsword. Being able to enter melee combat to just hit, not even kill enemies, to quickly vent peril gives you the option to then dodge back and channel Smite for CC, all without breaking your combat flow to quell. I'll expand more on this in the how to play this build and the tips and tricks section. For now, let's continue. We'll take both Channeled Force and Empiric Shock since the Electro Staff benefits greatly from both. Together, these nodes allow you to dish out quite a bit of hurt to crushers and even monsters too. I have also chosen to take the Lightning Speed node, not just because it has the word lightning in it, which is on theme with the build, but it also makes the Force Greatsword so much nicer to use as well. Empathetic Evasion is a core talent in any crit-heavy build, and the Electro Staff is the prime example of that. This talent allows you to be immune to taking range damage, which means you are extremely difficult to gun down when trading shots. We'll also pick up Anticipation to supplement our build's generally low mobility. For our combat ability, I have chosen to take Telkine Shield, which I will call Barricade from now on. But as you can see, there are no supporting nodes yet, which means this isn't strictly a bubble-only build. The remainder of the talent points will go into supporting our damage output with Vulnerable Minds and Warp Rider, as well as picking the strong pairing of Empiric Resolve and Warp Ghost to offset the drop in toughness replenishment for the huge peril resistance gain. With this, the core nodes for the Storm Witch are in place. Where the remaining talents will go will depend on some factors as mentioned earlier. If you want to have fun in Damnation and Auric Maelstroms, or already have an Infernal Bubble Psyker in your Havoc team, then I would suggest taking both Enervating Threshold and Bolstered Shield, giving us the addictive ability to neutralize special advances and make plays that just feel so good. I'll then take Warp Siphon and Warp Battery to provide some supporting damage and the all-important cooldown boost to improve our barricade's uptime. The remaining point goes into Penetration of the Soul, or POTS. This might come as a surprise, but on this build, the extra rending can really put in the work for the Electro Staff's primary attack. In fact, let me just talk about that here. This is the Void Bolt's damage profile, the primary attack of the Electro Staff, which you'll be spamming pretty much the entire game. It has an ADM of 1 across all armor types except for 2. Unyielding and Carapace, which have about 0.6 and 0.1 ADM respectively. This means that when it comes to pummeling Crushers, Bulwarks, Reapers, and monsters, there is actually some room to improve your damage by a sizable amount. The extra 16 to 18% rending you'll normally benefit from is going to make using your staff against these enemies noticeably more effective, which is why I'm not too concerned about depending on my melee to fend them off. Here's an example of how effective it can be on a Damnation level Crusher with 6.5k health. Not too bad, huh? Given how weak it was initially. On the other hand, the Electro Staff's charge attack already has an ADM of 0.9 against Carapace, so it won't benefit much from pots, but it does help give the attack a little more oomph against Crushers. This build has more damage and utility, but less defense since you aren't running Bubble, and you don't have the additional toughness regeneration from Sanctuary. If you find yourself struggling to stay alive, you can remove pots and take Essence Harvest instead for additional toughness regeneration. You can also, of course, switch to Bubble and take Sanctuary if you want, but in my personal opinion, flat is justice in this case. If you are deciding to run the Stormwitch build as the core Psyker in a Havoc group, then it's likely you'll need to provide your team with more than just a constant bombardment of Void Bolts. To do this, we will swap to Bubble and Sanctuary to provide a solid anchor point to fight within. If your team has a competent veteran running smokes, then personally I would still run Barricade since smoke and bubble kind of double dip in function. I find the space created from stopping the train of specials to be very helpful in many scenarios. This would technically be the only change to make if your team has a strong horde clear without needing to depend on an Inferno Staff. If you don't, then you'll need to make use of Empowered Smite to help out with that, shifting away from Warp Siphon and picking the necessary Empowered Psionic Keystone nodes. Taking this allows your Smite to actually kill hordes and deal with bruises fairly well. You won't kill elites or heavily armored enemies with it, but you'll do enough to let your team focus on the important things while they are stunned. That concludes the total build for the Stormwitch. As you see, I've been playing around with various different combinations of shields, whether it's Barricade or Bubble, and messing with different keystone combinations. In the end, which combination you take will depend on what works best for the mission and the team composition you've got. I will always enjoy playing with the Barricade instead of Bubble for this build specifically, but that's just my personal preference. Now, let's move on to how to actually play this build and what your responsibility is going to be as a Stormwitch. Before we get into this, I wouldn't recommend playing this build when against Rotten Armor or Cranial Corruption modifier. This build is going to have its effectiveness heavily neutralized and also make life harder for your team. As for your role, your job is to bombard the heresy out of enemies with Void Bolts, spamming your primary attack to take down range enemies, gunners, elites, and specials as your priority. If you are dealing with Crushers or Bulwarks, weave in primary attacks to activate Empiric Shock on them and charge attacks to buff up your Void Bolts with Channeled Force. As you saw earlier, you can really dish out the hurt to these enemies. If a mixed horde of enemy elites are coming your way, bombarding them from afar is a great way to soften and thin them out as they rush towards your team. From here, if you still have the space to do so, continue to unleash barrage after barrage of attacks, focusing on elites to trigger Perilous Combustion to spread damage around and support horde clearing. If it is no longer safe to use your staff, switch to melee to clear some space for yourself, quelling peril in the process if needed. Block proactively to stagger enemies and use the force push to stop attacks from rages and crushers. Should the horde threat be large enough, there are bulwarks, crushers, and rages in the mix, now might be the time to whip out your smite to hold the front line and buy time for your team to dispatch them. If you have empowered smite, poxwalkers and bruisers are likely to outright die, depending on your channel time. A very, very important note on smite usage here. When you choose to use smite is very important. It's really the difference between being a master of your tools and a warp empowered potato. Because Smite locks enemies in place, your allies have to go up to them and fight. And if you lock the enemies in a terrible spot, like out in the open, then your allies risk getting shot at while trying to close the gap. Learning when to use will come with experience, but I can say that holding enemies locked at an angle and away from the open and within cover is usually a good strategy. You are basically deciding where your allies are going to fight, so decide well. Of course, you can't always choose where and when you get to use Smite, but it is your job to make the environment as advantageous as possible for your allies. If it means dropping down a bubble or barricade to provide some cover for your allies before you channel Smite, then you do that. If after the first round of Smite things are still very much alive, you have the decision of re-engaging in melee to quell peril, repeat, and maybe build up some stacks for your force cleave, or find space to quell and recast a second round of Smite. Should most of the horde be dealt with already, switch back to the Electro Staff and continue bombarding what remains of the enemy. If a boss or a monster appears, your role is to make space for your team to deal with it while you hold the horde back. This is basically the same as the Inferno Psyker would do as well, where needed, and focus on keeping your team safe. Hopefully that was instructional enough to give you an idea on what kind of responsibilities you need to manage as part of taking this build. Finally, I'm going to give you some pointers and advice on how to utilize your kit to its fullest. When it comes to using your barricade, first, make it a habit of dropping it at choke points to completely seal off an area from specials entering. This is best done in doorways and other locations where specials have no choice but to go through. Do note that sometimes dogs and mutants might stumble their way through your barricade, so keep an eye out. Second, in general, you'll want to drop your barricade in the direction that your team wants to clear out. However, if there are shooters from multiple angles, place the barricade closer to yourself and your team, or at least the person who is up front drawing fire and shooting back. Since the barricade is actually curved, you have the most cover when you are up against it in the middle. On this note, you can actually change the direction your barricade is facing by using the primary fire while holding it out. Third, your barricade can also be used as an instant stun to free your allies from being smashed by mutants. You can also drop a barricade to stop flamers from setting your allies on fire too. This is useful if they absolutely cannot take any more damage. Better to trade a cooldown for a wound if it means keeping them alive for longer. Finally, if you find yourself being flanked by gunfire from the side, you can clip yourself into the barricade to provide yourself with some cover, making use of the slight curvature to your advantage. When it comes to using Smite, apart from what I've already explained, here's a useful table to show you how much Smite power you've got depending on how much peril you cast it at. Needless to say, don't smite groups of regular enemies that your staff or melee can handle on its own. Do you know how uncool you look smiting a small group of Poxwalkers, especially if you aren't using empowered psionics? Hardly fitting behavior for a Storm Witch. A rule of thumb to remember if you're wondering how big a group of elites like Crushers and Bulwarks needs to be to warrant using Smite, I like to remember it like this. If it's more than 3, it's Smite for thee. Anything less, and your Electro Staff's charge attack can manage just fine on its own, since it can stun up to 2 enemies no matter the charge level. Speaking of your staff, your peril equilibrium is going to be at 80%. This is the point where most of your buffs are at their maximum effectiveness, while still affording you some peril buffer to actually make use of it. Ideally, stay within the 80% range, but I wouldn't drop below 60% unless I was preparing for a full channel of Smite for crowd control and clearing. With that, we've reached the end of this pretty comprehensive build guide. I wonder how many of you actually sat through all the information at the end. If you did, I'll let you in on a little spoiler. The research for this build has resulted in another version of the Storm Witch I'm still testing as I write this, but I'm pretty stoked to see if that build is viable. Stay tuned for some warp devastation to come. This video took so much longer than I expected because of how much stress testing I needed to do to make this build viable in Havoc 40. It's no Cinder Mage by any stretch of the imagination, but then very little is going to compare with having infinite cleave, powerful crowd control, and massive damage in a single weapon. This build is actually pretty intense to use because you need to manage peril, positioning, target priority, and keeping yourself alive all at once. There's actually very little breathing space, and you need to be a proficient enough player to make this work in Havoc 40, especially as the sole Psyker of the team. If you find yourself dying a lot, just know that it's going to take some practice to really lock in the muscle memory for playing this build. Far more complex than using the Inferno Staff. With that, thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Varlets.